In 2020, the Supreme Court quietly ended a 6-year legal fight over just a few notes in the opening of Stairway to Heaven, and Led Zeppelin walked away from the entire ordeal without paying a single dollar to anyone. That's just one of several huge hits built on melodies that weren't fully their own, and some of the biggest names in music walked away from the accusations completely unscathed. So today, we're counting down 10 ripoffs of 1970s classic songs you won't believe they got away with. Number 10, Run Through the Jungle by Creedence Clearwater Revival. Released in April 1970 on the album Cosmos Factory, this swampy hypnotic single, written entirely by John Fogerty, became one of CCR's biggest hits, eventually going gold and helping define the band's signature sound. 15 years later, in 1985, John Fogerty released a solo comeback single called The Old Man Down the Road, and Saul Zaentz, the owner of Fantasy Records, who controlled the rights to every CCR song Fogerty had ever written, sued him for copyright infringement. Zaentz's argument was almost impossible to believe. He claimed Fogerty had ripped off Run Through the Jungle to write his new song, meaning the same man who wrote both songs was effectively being accused of plagiarizing his own earlier work. The case went to trial in late 1988, and Fogerty brought his own guitar directly into the courtroom, playing extended live sections of both songs for the jury over the course of 2 weeks, to demonstrate that his own distinctive swamp rock style simply happened to sound remarkably like his own distinctive swamp rock style. After just 2 short hours of deliberation, the jury sided decisively with Fogerty, and the case later helped establish an important, lasting Supreme Court precedent on the recovery of legal fees in copyright disputes more broadly. Zaentz had also separately sued Fogerty for $144 million over a different pair of songs, originally titled Zans Can't Dance and later renamed Vans Can't Dance after pressure from lawyers, which many people interpreted as thinly veiled insults aimed directly at Zaentz himself and his business practices. And that defamation dispute was ultimately settled quietly out of court for an undisclosed sum. Because Fogerty had spent well over $1 million of his own money defending himself throughout the plagiarism case, he pursued reimbursement of those legal fees all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled unanimously in his favor in 1994, establishing a lasting legal precedent that still protects songwriters who successfully defend themselves against copyright claims to this day. Fogerty won outright, proving that even the man being accused of the ripoff could walk away completely clean. Number 9, My Sweet Lord by George Harrison. Released in November 1970 on Harrison's triple album All Things Must Pass, this song became his first solo number 1 and one of the biggest hits by any former Beatle. Bright Tunes Music, which owned the publishing rights to the Chiffons' 1963 hit He's So Fine, sued Harrison just months later in February 1971, arguing that his melody was essentially identical to theirs, with different lyrics simply layered on top. The case dragged on for 5 years before finally reaching trial in February 1976, when Judge Richard Owen ruled that Harrison had committed what the court called subconscious plagiarism, meaning he likely absorbed the earlier song's melody at some point in the past, without ever consciously intending to copy it. Because ownership of the Chiffons song changed hands during the lengthy litigation, the final damages weren't settled until 1981, when Harrison was ordered to pay $587,000. Harrison always maintained that he had drawn his actual creative inspiration from the gospel song Oh Happy Day, rather than the Chiffons record, having heard it performed during a European tour shortly before writing his own song. and his former bandmate Ringo Starr later defended him publicly, telling Melody Maker magazine that Harrison had simply been unlucky, since countless songs throughout history share melodic similarities without anyone ever noticing or caring. In an odd postscript to the whole affair, the Chiffons themselves recorded their own cover version of My Sweet Lord in 1975, while the lawsuit was still very much ongoing, apparently hoping to cash in on some of the publicity surrounding the years-long case. Despite losing the case and paying real money for it, Harrison's song remained enormously popular and is still widely considered one of his greatest achievements, a rare case where a rip-off verdict barely dented the song's legacy at all.
My sweet Lord.
Number 8, Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin.
Yes, there are two paths you can go by,
Released in November 1971 on the band's untitled fourth studio album, this song became arguably the most famous rock recording of the entire decade, built around a slow, descending guitar figure that gradually opens the track before building toward its famous conclusion. In 2014, a trustee for the estate of Spirit guitarist Randy Wolf filed suit, claiming Led Zeppelin's Jimmy Page and Robert Plant had lifted that opening from Spirit's 1968 instrumental Taurus, a song the two bands had actually toured together while performing decades earlier. A 2016 jury trial in Los Angeles ruled in Zeppelin's favor after roughly a week of testimony, finding the two songs were not substantially similar enough to constitute infringement. But a 3-judge appeals panel initially threw out that verdict over what it called faulty jury instructions, before a larger full panel of judges ultimately restored the original decision in March 2020. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear any further appeal later that same year, ending the case for good.
really makes me wonder.
Randy Wolf, who performed under the stage name Randy California and died in 1997, years before the lawsuit was ever formally filed, had reportedly complained for years that people kept asking him why Stairway to Heaven sounded so much like Taurus, since Spirit and Led Zeppelin had actually toured together on the same bill back in 1968 and 1969, well before either song was released. Much of the eventual legal outcome hinged on a technicality baked into the law of that earlier era, since federal copyright protection did not extend to actual sound recordings until 1972, meaning jurors in the case were only ever allowed to compare the two songs' written sheet music rather than listen to the original studio recordings side by side. Even though Page himself admitted under oath that he owned a copy of the Spirit album containing Taurus well before writing Stairway to Heaven, Led Zeppelin still walked away from the entire 6-year legal battle without paying a single cent.
Flying the stairway to heaven.
Number 7, Soul Makossa by Manu Dibango. Released in 1972 as the B-side to a song celebrating Cameroon's national football team ahead of that year's continental tournament, this track's chanted refrain, sung in the Douala language, became an unlikely dance floor sensation after a New York club DJ discovered an import copy and played it on repeat, eventually pushing it into the American charts. A decade later, Michael Jackson, working closely with producer Quincy Jones on what would become his most important album, lifted the same chant almost note for note, reworking its syllables slightly into a different language altogether for the closing section of Wanna Be Startin' Somethin', the opening track on his 1982 album Thriller, without ever asking Dibango for permission or offering him any credit whatsoever at the time of release. Dibango eventually found out about the borrowed chant only after a friend happened to mention the unlikely collaboration to him, and he sued Jackson soon afterward, with Jackson quietly settling out of court in 1986, agreeing to pay Dibango 1 million French francs for the unauthorized use of his signature chant. The story didn't end there, though, since Dibango filed suit again in 2009, this time against both Jackson and Rihanna, after Rihanna sampled the very same Jackson recording, chant included, for her own hit Don't Stop the Music, arguing that both artists owed him proper credit for a phrase that had already earned him a settlement once before. Dibango had originally written the chant as a modest B-side tribute to Cameroon's national football team ahead of the 1972 Africa Cup of Nations tournament, never once expecting the little track to go anywhere at all, until a New York club DJ named David Mancuso happened to discover an import copy sitting in a Brooklyn record shop and began playing it repeatedly at his invite-only club, The Loft, where dancers kept demanding to hear it played again and again all night long. That grassroots popularity eventually pushed the song into mainstream American radio years before Jackson ever got hold of it. Thriller went on to become the best-selling album of all time, meaning a few borrowed syllables from an obscure Cameroonian B-side ended up embedded in the most commercially successful record in music history. Number 6, Let's Get It On by Marvin Gaye.
I've been really trying, babe.
Released in August 1973 and co-written with producer Ed Townsend, this song became Gaye's biggest hit to that point in his career and one of the most recognizable, most sampled soul recordings ever made, selling more than 2 million copies within weeks of its release. In 2017, the heirs of Ed Townsend filed suit against Ed Sheeran, claiming his 2014 Grammy-winning hit, Thinking Out Loud, borrowed the harmonic progression and rhythmic feel of the Gaye classic, closely enough to count as copyright infringement, and pointing specifically to concert footage of Sheeran blending the two songs together on stage as supporting evidence. The case finally went to trial in a Manhattan federal courtroom in the spring of 2023, and Sheeran testified for several consecutive days, at one point picking up a guitar right there on the witness stand, to demonstrate just how common the underlying four-chord progression in question really is across decades and decades of popular music history.
Sugar, let's get it on.
After roughly 3 hours of deliberation following the 2-week trial, the jury ruled unanimously in Sheeran's favor, finding that he had created Thinking Out Loud independently and without copying any protected elements of Gaye's earlier composition. Ed Townsend, who co-wrote Let's Get It On with Gaye and died in 2003, never lived to see the case his heirs eventually brought, which took 6 full years to reach trial after being filed back in 2017. During the 2-week trial, prosecutors pointed to a video of Sheeran performing a live mashup of both songs in concert as what they called smoking gun proof of copying, though Sheeran testified that blending songs together on stage was simply a common trick he used to keep his solo shows entertaining. The U.S. Supreme Court later declined to revive the case in a separate related lawsuit brought by a different rights holder, closing the door on the matter for good and allowing Sheeran to keep every dollar Thinking Out Loud had earned.
Let's get it on.
Number 5, The Air That I Breathe by the Hollies. Written by British Gibraltarian singer-songwriter Albert Hammond and English lyricist Mike Hazelwood, this song was first recorded by Hammond himself on his 1972 debut album before the Hollies took their own cover version to number 2 on the UK charts in early 1974, making it the band's final major hit single. In 1992, Radiohead released Creep as part of their debut album Pablo Honey, and the song's publisher, Rondor Music, which represented Hammond and Hazelwood's writer's share of the earlier song, quickly noticed how closely its bridge resembled the Hollies' recording, right down to a single distinctive chord that briefly clashes with the song's overall key. Because Radiohead's own rhythm guitarist, Ed O'Brien, had reportedly pointed out the resemblance to his bandmates during the recording process itself, the case against them was, according to those directly involved, close to a foregone conclusion from the very start, and the band ultimately settled out of court rather than take their chances at trial. Hammond and Hazelwood were added as official co-writers of Creep, entitling them to a meaningful share of the song's publishing income for as long as the track keeps generating royalties. The Hollies' hit version followed an earlier 1973 recording of the same song by Phil Everly of the Everly Brothers, though it was the Hollies' rendition that became the internationally recognized version. Music analysts examining the legal case pointed specifically to an unusual chord in the song's structure, an out-of-key note that creates a moment of surprise in both recordings, as one of the clearest pieces of evidence tying the two songs together. Decades later, when Radiohead itself sued Lana Del Rey over similarities between Creep and her song Get Free, critics couldn't help pointing out the irony of a band once accused of the very same thing turning around and pursuing someone else for it. The connection between the two songs even resurfaced in 2024, when the horror film Heretic referenced both tracks directly in its plot. For Got to Give It Up by Marvin Gaye. Released in March 1977 on the album of the same name, this disco-funk single became Gaye's final #1 hit on the Billboard Hot 100, reaching the top of the chart that June and driven largely by its loose, party-like groove and ad-libbed vocal delivery. In March 2013, Robin Thicke and Pharrell Williams released Blurred Lines, and listeners almost immediately noticed how closely its overall feel echoed Gaye's earlier hit, prompting Thicke and Williams to preemptively sue Gaye's family later that August, seeking a court declaration confirming that they hadn't infringed anything at all. The Gaye family swiftly countersued, and in March 2015, a Los Angeles jury sided against Thicke and Williams, awarding the family $7.4 million in what was, at the time, the largest verdict ever handed down in a modern music copyright case, beating out even Michael Bolton's earlier infringement judgment. An appeals court later reduced that jury figure to about $5.3 million, but upheld the underlying finding of infringement in March 2018. And the final judgment entitled Gaye's family to half of all future royalties earned from Blurred Lines going forward indefinitely, on top of the substantial damages that had already been awarded to them years earlier. Marvin Gaye was credited as the sole writer of Got to Give It Up, and because his family only owned the copyright to the sheet music that had been deposited with the U.S. Copyright Office rather than rights to the actual studio recording itself, the jury in the trial never even heard the two records played side by side, instead comparing written musical notation alone on paper. Rapper T.I., who also appeared as a featured artist on Blurred Lines, was ultimately cleared of any liability in the case, with the jury's finding of infringement resting entirely on the shoulders of Thicke and Williams as the credited songwriters. Unlike several other cases on this list, this is one ripoff accusation that did not get away with anything, standing today as the clearest cautionary tale in the entire industry about how far borrowing a song's feel can go before it becomes outright theft. Number 3, "Daya Think I'm Sexy" by Rod Stewart. Released in November 1978 as the lead single from the album Blondes Have More Fun, this disco-tinged track became one of the biggest hits of Stewart's entire career, eventually spending 4 full weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in early 1979. Brazilian musician Jorge Ben-Jor noticed almost immediately that the song's chorus melody was nearly identical to his own 1972 track, Taj Mahal, which Stewart had very likely heard while attending Rio de Janeiro's famous Carnival celebration earlier that same year on tour. Ben-Jor filed suit not long after the song became a global hit, and the two sides settled the matter amicably out of court, with Stewart agreeing to donate all of the single's future royalties to UNICEF, rather than drag the dispute through a lengthy trial. Stewart later admitted in his 2012 autobiography that the borrowing was a case of unconscious plagiarism, insisting the melody had simply lodged itself in his memory during his time in Brazil. Beyond its 4 weeks atop the American charts, the song also topped the charts in Canada for 4 straight weeks and in Australia for 2. And Stewart performed the track live at the Music for UNICEF concert held inside the United Nations General Assembly Hall in January 1979, not long after quietly agreeing to the settlement with Ben-Jor's legal team. In something of a bonus twist, Stewart also separately admitted he had consciously lifted the song's synthesizer riff from a Bobby Womack string arrangement, reasoning that copying a small piece of someone's arrangement, rather than their actual melody, fell into a legal gray area that let him get away with it without any consequence at all. Number 2, Good Times by Chic. Released in the summer of 1979 as a single from Chic's album of the same name, this Nile Rodgers and Bernard Edwards composition became one of the defining disco anthems of the entire era, anchored by one of the most instantly recognizable bass lines ever committed to a record. That same September, a newly assembled trio called the Sugar Hill Gang, put together by producer Sylvia Robinson specifically for the project, released Rapper's Delight, built almost entirely around a re-recorded version of that exact bass line and string arrangement, played live by studio musicians rather than sampled outright, since the technology to loop a clean sample didn't really exist yet in 1979. Rodgers first heard the record himself while out at a New York club called Leviticus, and was reportedly stunned to realize an entire unlicensed song had been built directly on top of his own work, without so much as a courtesy phone call beforehand. He and Edwards threatened legal action, and Sugar Hill Records settled by adding both men as official co-writers on what would go on to become the song widely credited with introducing hip-hop to a mainstream audience. Even with that particular resolution in place, a rapper named Grandmaster Caz, whose original handwritten rhymes had also been lifted nearly word for word by one of Sugar Hill Gang's own members after loaning the man his personal notebook full of lyrics, never received any songwriting credit or royalties at all for his contribution, later addressing the lingering slight directly in his own 2000 song, MC Delight. Queen would go on to borrow a strikingly similar 3-note pattern from that very same Good Times bass line for their own massive 1980 hit. Another One Bites the Dust, though their version only echoed the opening notes closely enough to be considered fair inspiration rather than outright infringement, meaning Rodgers and Edwards never pursued a legal case against Queen the way they had with the Sugar Hill Gang years earlier. Number 1, Oops Upside Your Head by the Gap Band. Released in 1979 on the album The Gap Band 2, this funk single became one of the defining dance floor hits of the disco era for the three Wilson brothers and their band, known especially for its call and response energy that had crowds sitting down on the floor together and rowing along to the beat as one. In late 2014, Mark Ronson and Bruno Mars released Uptown Funk, and listeners quickly noticed how closely its rhythm, groove, and overall arrangement echoed the Gap Band's earlier hit from 35 years prior, drawing comparisons that only grew louder and more legally significant after the massive success of the Blurred Lines verdict earlier that same year. Rather than risk a costly courtroom battle so soon after that landmark ruling against Thicke and Williams, representatives for Ronson and Mars settled the matter directly and relatively quickly, adding all three Wilson brothers, along with two of their original producers and collaborators, to the official songwriting credits in April 2015. The settlement gave the Gap Band's team a reported 17% share of the song's publishing royalties going forward, a substantial and genuinely lucrative cut of what would go on to become one of the single best-selling singles of the entire decade across the globe. The phrase itself had already taken on a life of its own decades earlier, becoming a popular football chant sung in stadiums across both Britain and Ireland, and rapper Snoop Dogg had even recorded his own tribute version called Snoop's Upside Ya Head, featuring original Gap Band lead singer Charlie Wilson, years before the Uptown Funk dispute ever even arose. Uptown Funk spent 14 weeks at #1 in the United States and 7 weeks atop the UK charts, meaning that 17% share turned out to be worth a genuine fortune for a group most casual listeners had almost entirely forgotten. 10 songs, 10 completely different legal outcomes, and yet, in more than half of these cases, the accused party walked away without truly losing a thing, whether through a favorable jury verdict, a quiet, out-of-court settlement, or simply outlasting the other side through years of litigation. It's a reminder that some of the most beloved, most celebrated songs in music history were built, at least in some part, on melodies and grooves that somebody else had already written first, whether anyone involved wanted to admit it at the time or not. If any of these stories surprised you, let us know which one shocked you the most down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this look behind the curtain of music's biggest hits, give this video a like and subscribe for more deep dives into the songs you grew up with and thought you already knew everything about.